Welcome to the 7th meeting of the Local Government and Communities Committee in 2020, and can I remind everyone present to turn off their mobile phones. I welcome Jeremy Balfour to the committee. Jeremy replaces Alexander Stewart, who's taken on a different role within his party. Alexander was with the committee from its inception in 2016, and I want to put on record the committee's thanks to him for his service. Jeremy has big boots to fill in Alexander's case. For agenda item 1, I ask Jeremy Balfour to indicate whether he has any relevant interest to declare.
Nothing to declare, Convener.
Thank you very much.
Can I say that I have something to declare, particularly for this session, because I have a flat that's rented to a third party and is affected by the cladding issues.
Okay, thank you very much. Agenda item 2 is consideration of whether to take agenda items 6 and 7 in private. Item 6 is consideration of evidence heard today on building regulations and fire safety in Scotland. Item 7 is consideration of next steps in relation to its digital engagement exercise and community wellbeing. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. That is agreed. Agenda item 3 is consideration of the draft Energy Efficiency Domestic Private Rented Property Scotland Regulations 2020. The committee will first take evidence in the instrument, and I welcome Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, Karen Major, Private Rented Sector Regulations, Scottish Government, and Norman MacLeod, Senior Principal Legal Officer, Scottish Government. This instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before the provisions can come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider the motion to approve the instrument, and I invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to you all. I thank you for the opportunity to appear today in regards to the Energy Efficiency Domestic Private Rented Property Scotland Regulations 2020. Our programme for government included a commitment to introduce minimum standards for the energy efficiency of homes in the private rented sector let out for new tenancies from 1st of April 2020. These regulations fulfil that commitment using the Energy Act 2011, in force since 1st of July 2019. We've also drawn up the responses to a number of public consultations, the most recent of which was held last summer, in drawing up all these regulations. The standards that they establish will make an important contribution to the removal of poor energy efficiency in the private rented sector, which is a driver for fuel poverty. With the most recent figures for 2018 showing that 36% of households in this sector are fuel poor, the importance of taking this action is quite clear. The regulations also flag the wider expectations of Energy Efficient Scotland to introduce standards for energy efficiency across all building stock in Scotland. Further to standards set in the social sector through EISH, it heralds another important step for the 20-year Energy Efficient Scotland programme. The standards introduced will be phased in over 5 years and will use the widely recognised Energy Performance Certificate as the yardstick for energy efficiency. First of all, there will be a prohibition on the letting of new tenancies which fall below an EPC band of E from the 1st of October 2020. This standard must then be met by all tenancies by 31st of March 2022. The standard increases to EPC band D from 1st of April 2022, again for new tenancies first, and by the 31st of March 2025, all private rented properties will be required to meet this EPC band D standard. The regulations allow for various exemptions to the standard to take into account individual circumstances and the variety of building stock found in the private rented sector. Some examples of these include the cost of the work exceeding £5,000 for each standard set, a sitting tenant or a third party refusing to allow the required works to take place, or the likelihood that the necessary works would have a negative impact on the fabric or structure of the property. We will work with stakeholders to finalise non-statutory guidance to support the rollout of these changes. If the committee approves these regulations, my officials will publish draft guidance on the 1st of April, which will be used as a platform for conversations with local authorities and landlords during the spring of this year. And to conclude, these regulations introduce minimum standards for energy efficiency in the private rented sector, an approach which helps to ensure that private tenants are able to live in homes where they do not have to trade off paying for heating and spending on other basic needs. Thank you, Convener, and I apologise for the croakiness.
Thank you very much, Minister. I invite questions from members. Andy?
Thanks, Convener. Just a few questions. The cost cap of £5,000, was any consideration given to having regional variations on this? Because, for example, here in Edinburgh, a third of tenants live in pre-1919 tenements, which are probably quite relatively more expensive to introduce energy efficiency measures to than other parts of the country.
No, we haven't looked at regional variations, but there are many parts of the country like Edinburgh that have pre-1919 tenements, my own constituency being one of those places. And from my own knowledge of the past, in terms of the Victorian tenement scheme that took place in Aberdeen, I think that number itself would take account of requirements to do some of these buildings, and that would fall in, without a doubt, into that figure. But, Convener, as I always say to the committee, we will continue to keep an eye on all of this as we move forward. If we think there is any need for any variation in the future, if folk are falling out of the net in all of this, we will look at that very carefully indeed.
And just a couple of questions on the register. In the instrument, is it? It's not clear from the exemption register whether this will be a separate register to the existing landlord register, or whether this will just be adding fields to that database.
I'll take Ms Majoran to answer that question, Convener, please.
So yeah, it's a separate register because the landlord register that exists at the minute is based on landlord, not property. So the one that we're talking about here is going to be based on property. So it'll be a separate thing held by each local authority.
Right. Was any thought given to amending the existing register so there's like one where people can go?
Convener, we are looking at this moment in time at the existing register. It is very basic in terms of some of the functionality of it. I think it would have caused some difficulty if we were to add that function in to the existing register. But I can assure the committee that we are reviewing the way that the current register operates to see if other functionality can come into play in the future to deal with a huge number of aspects of that.
And the exemptions register is, as it says, an exemptions register. Will there be any register of properties that have actually had energy efficiency measures applied to them?
Convener, there won't, but I think that what we will see ourselves as we move forward is, where that exemptions exist, we will have a huge list of the reasoning for that. All my expectation would be that others actually meet these standards.
Okay, and finally, sorry, no, just one more question.
Okay,
thank you. In terms of the cost cap, so you're exempt if, for example, the actual costs exceed 5,000. How is that assessed? Is that just going to be on quotes? Because I can see quite a bit of scope for creative quotes coming in at 5,001.
Convener, I can assure the committee that we will keep an eye on any creativity that goes on. I stand to be corrected by Ms Major here, but in terms of our reckoning, in terms of these changes, the average change at the beginning will cost around about the region of £1,140, is that right?
Something like
yeah, £1,140. I think it would be very creative indeed in some cases if folk were going to exceed some of these numbers. However, in saying that, we do know, and I've spoken to this committee before, that there are some properties at this moment where it would be very difficult to introduce measures because of the nature of the building. I gave an example in terms of questioning that I had about East previously, about Napoleonic council housing in Orkney, which late 18th, early 19th century, where you couldn't externally clad those buildings, and you cannot internally do anything because you actually reduce the size of the rooms so dramatically. Now, folks are happy with that, and we've got to realise that we do have some old buildings out there which at this moment in time we don't have the technology to deal with. So they would fall into that area of beyond the 5,000, and in some cases, you know, there's not a huge amount that could be done. However, what I can assure the committee is, as we move forward with Energy Efficient Scotland across the board, in all sectors, we will be doing all that we can to ensure that we are doing right across the country all that we can to make our homes more energy efficient, to reduce fuel poverty, and also to curb our carbon emissions.
Okay,
Thank you very much. Minister, welcome these regulations. Just have a couple of issues I want to ask. Firstly, about resources. I see you've been in conversation with COSLA and local authorities. What additional resources will be required to carry out the regulatory enforcement? And is this going to be something that's covered by existing local authority officers, or are we going to see new people recruited to make sure the enforcement works in practice? And secondly, about the actual investment, the extent to which this works will feed into the area-based schemes that are out there already. So firstly about the work to enforce, and then secondly the actual improvement works.
Convener, I would never dictate to local authorities how they handle some of these issues, but we in this area, as in many others, are committed to working with local authorities, and we're in the process of setting up formal governance arrangements with COSLA and with Solace to oversee the strategic planning of Energy Efficient Scotland programme as a whole. As it stands at the moment, and Ms Boyack is very well aware of this, our HEAPS area-based scheme programme are managed by local authorities, and I could see this fitting in well. In certain parts of the country, certain local authorities have made great efforts in trying to ensure that owner-occupiers and landlords enter into the HEAPS ABS programmes that are available. And, you know, they are quite persuasive in terms of ensuring that folk know that they have access to loan funding to be able to carry out those works. Beyond that, Convener, I've made it clear, and I think, again, I've said this to the committee before, we actually, all of us need to be more proactive, and I know that some local authorities are, in terms of ensuring that owner-occupiers and landlords who choose not to access the schemes are told that, you know, by not doing so, they're actually causing themselves possibly some difficulties in the future, not just in terms of not complying with these changes, but also in terms of selling on their property in the future. I think I gave an example previously about an area in the north of Glasgow, Cadder, where, you know, that entire area benefited from the HEAPS ABS programme, but certain folks chose not to participate. And there was a stark contrast in terms of house prices from sales of those that had entered into the programme and those that had not. And I think that's something that we have to get over to folks, that, you know, by not doing this and not entering into some of the HEAPS ABS programme, if they have that opportunity, they might actually be causing themselves a liability in the future. I don't know if I covered all bases there.
In terms of the energy efficient investment schemes, yes,
Yeah.
absolutely, it is an opportunity to highlight the fact that these schemes are there, and having the regulations tying into that opportunity, I think, is critical. On the local authorities, it wasn't about instructing local authorities, it was more about the comment about the need to make sure that the timescale worked and that local authorities were capable of gearing up. So it was really a question of, are we happy that the local authorities are ready to gear up, and are we looking at new staff, or are we looking at existing staff to deliver the enforcement?
Convener, we have not had anything back from local authorities saying that they would find any difficulties with this. But as I said in my opening remarks, we've got that period between the publication of the guidance, 1st of April, and the implementation 1st of October, to be able to talk to local authorities and to stakeholders around about this. In my own dealings with folk at COSLA around about Energy Efficient Scotland, I think that, you know, local authorities are up for these changes, and we will, as I said, put in place formal governance arrangements to make sure that we do deliver in partnership with local authorities what is a very important strategic programme with Energy Efficient Scotland.
Thanks very much. Graham.
Morning, Minister. Have you any idea of the number of properties that may be involved here?
Gosh, if Mr Simpson bears with me, I will try and find that in this vast array of documentation that I have in front of me. Ah, here we go. There's efficiency for you. The regulations will cover properties where there is an EPC and where the tenancy is covered by the repairing standard, as the committee is well aware. The most recent Scottish Housing Condition Survey identifies that 26,000 properties in this area are EPC band F and G, which is about 10% of the stock in the private rented sector. They will be the ones affected by the first wave of the regulation. And a further 42,000 properties are currently EPC band E, which is 16% of the total, and they will be affected by the second wave of the changes in April 2022.
So 66,000 properties.
By my calculation, it is 68,000 properly.
68,000,
properties,
yes,
yeah.
you're right, 68,000 properties.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of properties, so it goes back to, I think, the previous question about how, you know, are the resources there to monitor all this in councils? It's quite a big extra workload, it seems to me.
From my experience, convener, in talking to folks who deliver heap SABS programmes in local authorities and some of the other energy efficiency schemes, what we have in many places is folks who are really expert in all of this. My hope, convener, and I think, again, I've said this either in the to committee or in the chamber, what we've seen from heap SABS thus far is a lot of local authorities concentrating on the low-hanging fruit. I know that local authorities are looking at moving further forward in terms of improving energy efficiency in various places and looking more at the private rented sector and owner-occupied sector and getting them involved. I see this as part of that work, to be honest with you. And what we have seen in various places is local authorities bringing together not only the heap SABS resources that they have, but resources from other areas as well, bringing that all together and delivering across the board in many, many parts of the country. And while, you know, this adds to the work in some regards, the reality is that in many places, many local authorities are doing this anyway.
How is a landlord or landlady going to know that they need to do work? How's that going to be communicated?
We are going to embark on communication starting from the 1st of April and talking to folks up until that 1st of October, that trigger date. We will use all means possible to communicate what those changes are, including using the good offices of the Scottish Association of Landlords, who are key, I think, in terms of helping us spread that message far and wide. Beyond that, convener, I think that we will also look at how we can communicate that through various organisations, Shelter and others, to tenants themselves, so that they know that what their rights are here, and they know if their landlord is not fulfilling the obligations that are laid out in these regulations.
Just one final question, convener, if that's okay. I could picture a scene where work is done on a property, but rent is put up as a result of the landlord spending money. And obviously, that, you know, in some parts of the probably all parts of the country, that wouldn't be the kind of outcome you're seeking.
Convener, of course, that is a possibility. But what I would hope for is that in circumstances like that, that landlords take cognizance of the fact of the situations that folk find themselves in. And of course, the other thing in all of this, convener, is that what we should also look at here is the whole cost to the tenant, the resident, because it may well be that in some cases there is a fair saving to be made in energy bills, sometimes with very, very little work carried out.
Okay. Thank you very much. No more questions. I move on to agenda item 4, the formal consideration of motion S5M 20854, calling for the Local Government and Communities Committee to recommend approval of the Draft Energy Efficiency Domestic Private Rented Property Scotland Regulations 2020. I invite the Minister to speak to and move this motion.
I'll just move, convener. Thank you.
Very much. Any contributions from the members? No. In that case, the question is that motion S5M 20854 in the name of the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning be approved. Are we all agreed? Yeah. Thank you. That is agreed. The committee will report on this instrument in due course, and I invite you to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft report of the publication. Thank you. I now suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover, and I hope you feel better soon, Minister. At agenda item 5, the committee will take evidence in building regulations and fire safety in Scotland. This is an issue in which the committee has a long-standing interest, and we issued a report in 2017. The particular focus of this session will be the issue of homes with cladding that have been assigned a zero value. I welcome Sandra White, who has a constituency interest in this matter. Once committee members have finished with their questions, I will allow Sandra to come in with some questions of her own. Today I welcome Phil Diamond, Chartered Building Surveyor, Diamond and Company, Matthew Jock, Principal UK Finance, Keith Denham, Director at Allied Surveyors, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, Brian Smith, Partner with Simpson and Marrick Solicitors, Law Society of Scotland, and Derek MacDonald, Joint Managing Director of Newton Property Management, Property Managers Association Scotland. Thank you for your written submissions, and I will start off by asking how widespread the issue of zero valuations is and what impact it's having on house sales across Scotland. Anybody like to?
I'll start. Evaluation of properties for preparation of home reports. There is a value placed on the property, and when the surveyor is asked to do a transcription to a bank or building society, we thereafter follow the lender's specific requirements, which states that there's to be a zero value when reporting to that lender.
Sorry, no, really, it wasn't a question, but are you telling me that you go looking for a zero valuation because that's what you were asked to do?
We will, when doing a report to a specific lender, we will put a zero value following the guidance that as chartered surveyors we are given by that lender. So we will follow the instructions of the lender. As we do in preparation of any valuation to a bank or building society, we will follow the guidance of that lender.
Maybe it's just me, maybe I'm confused here, but do you not go and make a valuation based on survey you do?
We put a value on the property for the home report. We'll put a market value of the home report subject to clarification of the issue of cladding on that building. Then if there is a request to go to a bank or building society, we will then follow the guidance of that specific lender, in which the majority of cases will say there's to be a zero figure entered in the valuation figure.
This is based around these cladding...
Based around the cladding
issues.
related issues.
Right, so there's two valuations on the house then?
There could be, no, I would say the zero valuation is not a valuation. The zero valuation is a process put in place to ensure that the mortgage processing goes correctly.
Again, I'm sorry if I appear dumb here,
No.
but how does a zero valuation assure that the mortgage process goes ahead correctly?
The valuation is a processing point of view. If you understand the process that we as surveyors will go through in reporting to a bank or building society, if we are reporting on, say, a traditional built property that has no cladding issues whatsoever, there will be a value stated on it, and that valuation will follow the guidance applicable to that lender. However, if you're then reporting on a property that's got a cladding, the lenders will say that until such time as clarification is obtained, the valuation figure in the report should be entered as zero.
So which means then that nobody with cladding they would be able to get a mortgage?
No, that's not correct. You'll get a mortgage. You'll get a mortgage subject to clarification, which would be the provision of an EWS1 form.
So they all start at zero and then have to prove themselves to be
There will be a value
something else?
written on the surveyor's notes to say the value of the property is whatever, for the instance, £200,000. And however, that will be on file based on the comparative evidence in arriving at that valuation. For the processing, the surveyor puts a value on it of zero until such time as the clarification of the EWS1 form is provided. Once that's provided, the valuation is then entered into the form.
Okay, let me ask then either yourself, Mr Denham, or somebody else, and don't feel you all have to answer the same questions anyway, because there is 5 of you after all. What impact is that having in house sales across Scotland at present?
Sorry to answer again. The impact is fairly significant. Not only will it affect the properties in developments that have cladding on them, but there is also a roll-on effect in the rest of the marketplace, in that people who would previously have sold a property if it had cladding would then consider buying another property. They can't sell the property, so therefore they're removed from the marketplace.
And has the EWS1 process helped unlock the sale of flats and high-rise buildings?
It has started to help the process move. Yes. It's only early stages just now, but it definitely has started to help the process improve.
Graham?
My understanding was this EWS1 form is not applicable in Scotland. Is that not correct?
No, that's not correct.
So it is being used here.
The EWS1 form is being used in Scotland, yes it is.
Okay. Now, the convener's first question was how many properties have been affected. Does anyone know that in Scotland?
No, I don't think we have that information.
No. So you don't know how many properties have been unable to sell?
No.
But the response was that it's fairly significant.
In certain parts of the country, in hotspots of the country, it can be significant in certain areas.
And where are the hotspots?
There'll be around developments, primarily around harbour side developments, be it in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee, but it's not limited to specific types of property. It can be limited. It can be other properties and other developments throughout the country. We don't know the extent of the problem.
No. Is it newer properties, older properties?
We have surveyed something like 300 plus developments at the moment, and there isn't a sort of stereotype of this. It tends to be stuff maybe from 1990 onwards. It's not necessarily stuck to any one point in time, but I suppose sandstone, tenemental stuff, Victorian and Georgian stuff, obviously not a problem there. But in the more kind of modern developments, yeah, there's certainly a significant problem with cladding on the buildings, a lot of which is actually physically combustible.
Right. So, Mr. Denham said that a zero valuation is applied until you can get clarity on what the cladding is. So once do you have to then survey the whole building?
Probably one
For the valuation point of view, you would undertake a general inspection of the building, and then we would ask or recommend that an EWS1 form is obtained, in which case then that's then passed on to the EWS1 form provider.
So the cost of that, though, is that shared among all the residents in a development?
Yeah.
If we backtrack to your first question, we have to look at the common fabric because that's the nature of the tenure in Scotland. So we need to look at the construction as a whole across the whole development, identify all the key elements of the cladding, i.e. what the different types are, all over the flats. And bear in mind, this is only relating to flats. So you could quite typically have a development with half a dozen stairwells and 30 different types of cladding on it. The nature of the tenure in Scotland is such that you can't get a professional indemnity policy to offer that comfort to all the people that form part of that development. So it has to be specific to the householder. And as it stands just now, unfortunately, that cost is borne in full by each individual householder.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So each individual householder.
Yep.
So let's say it's me. I want to sell a flat. I would have to pay for a survey on the whole development.
Technically that's correct, but it's the same as the valuation survey effectively, because what the valuation surveyor would do is he would look at the whole of the fabric and issue a valuation for that individual flatted dwelling. We can't, as chartered building surveyors, we can't treat that property in isolation. We have to look at the full extent of the common fabric, because that one flatted dwelling within that could be and is affected by what is in other common parts of the building, which in paper or in theory look as though they're unrelated, but they are part of the common fabric.
The subject of cost, because the cost is a concern for the initial work that the surveyor has to carry out. I think my colleagues would agree that that probably makes up the bulk of the initial cost. So property factors are trying to find a workaround for this, because we are limited, as Phil was saying there, that the initial survey is done, and then but what happens consequently? So for example, we have some blocks where we have approaching 100 units per block. The survey is for that individual risk for that block. So we're trying to come up with a workaround where, with the consent of the owners, the owners acknowledge collectively that this is to their benefit. And then once that knowledge base has been established, then each individual owner that consequently comes on to sell would have the option, subject to the surveyor's agreement, of a reduced cost, effectively for a duplicate certificate, but in their name, which would perhaps cover some of the element of the question mark about the PI. We're at the very early stages of this, and it's really just in situations where we're dealing with constituted committees, owners' committees, that we're able to kind of push this forward.
Yeah, and of course that doesn't exist in a lot of developments.
No, exactly, and that is an issue for the factor where we're working in a vacuum, and we're trying to consult with all of the owners and reach a decision on that.
So is the situation, sorry convener, but the situation in Scotland legally different to England in terms of having a legal entity that you can deal with? Is this part of the issue?
Well, our understanding is that south of the border, the legal entity that would sign off on the survey would be either the building owner or possibly the management company, who tend to be owned by the landlord, the original building owner, particularly in modern properties. And we're looking at these buildings, the majority of them that are affected are probably post-2000, post-2000.
Mr. MacDonald, you and I have spoken about this previously, and you were saying to me about this AWS form, that there is an issue in Scotland, in your view, with that.
Yes, there is, and the issue, as Phil was saying there, principally arises from the PI cover that is being provided by the surveyors that are providing the reports. So, for example, even if the owners collectively in a building decided that they were going to commission a communal survey, in our opinion, and maybe Matthew could advise on this, we understand that if that then subsequently was presented to a lender, they would look at it and say, well, hold on a minute, you've got 96 flats here that are being covered by £5 million worth of cover. That's inadequate. So in actual fact, the pushback is more likely to come from that direction. Ostensibly, I don't see a problem if we can gather the consent from the owners collectively.
Yeah.
If we could do that, as I said, it's easier if we have, and we're working very well with some committees on this. But I think the pushback is on the issue of the total amount of the PI cover.
Yeah. So where you don't have an owners association, you're having to track down individual owners, and that's can be difficult, and get a majority consent.
Yeah, so there's ways that we can approach that, but we need to be certain that there is a core-rate view within the development, particularly the larger developments.
I think they suggested you might have something to say on this, Mr. Duke.
Yeah, just to come on the back of that, the EWS form was designed to enable you to have one per block. We were very mindful when we were developing the process that there would be a cost implication to actually investigating the cladding on the outside of the building. We wanted to ensure that the people who live in those buildings didn't have to pay an excessive amount for that. So the idea of it is you have one per block and it lasts for 5 years, so it has a reasonable lifespan as well. Except that the property ownership situation in Scotland doesn't necessarily make that as easy a process as it does in the rest of the UK, but nonetheless the expectation is that you could have one per block. We might need to find a way to ensure that can happen, but the expectation is you can have just one.
Okay, so we still haven't found that way then. Right, so the earlier assertion that this EWS form is working in Scotland is not quite correct. We need to change it.
So I would say it is working because the workaround that we are doing in Scotland, because of the difference between the freeholder where it was originally set up, is that now individual homeowners are instructing the report themselves and getting that report over the element of the building that their property is occupied in, and that is then being passed to the purchaser. and to assist the purchase. So I would say that on that basis, yes, it is working. In an ideal world, would we like to have one report per block? Yes, we would. But I think we've got to have a workaround solution to get things back moving again in the Scottish property market.
But that will involve the agreement of the professional indemnity bodies as well in a big way, and that is a very, very significant cost to ensuring effectively the common fabric, because what Matthew's effectively suggesting is that a chartered building surveyor, whoever goes out to the property, looks at the common fabric and signs off on it. It's all very well, but that then has to be underwritten by the PI company, and the PI company will not grant 100 people access to the policy without what they call a commensurate level of fee. So those surveys could potentially be significantly expensive where they relate purely to EWS1. One of the things that as a business we're working on in the background with some of the factors is coming at it slightly differently, which may help. I would like to air that just now. We're doing construction identification surveys. So rather than calling them an EWS1 survey, we're actually creating a factual report, doing an investigative survey on buildings and traffic lighting them and saying, well, this is the extent of the common fabric, this is the building, this is how it's put together, and we go through the fabric elements on an Excel spreadsheet on an elevation by elevational basis and traffic light it red, amber, green. We're not doing anything other than physically looking at the common fabric, and that seems to be being treated in the same way as just a normal defect diagnosis on a building, like it needs a new roof or dry rot or a structural problem. And we're now getting quite a few instructions to do that from factors. And then at least the individual proprietors at least have the option to come to us directly and say, right, now can you give us the EWS1? That's starting to work. But we need to do that on a large scale basis, and clearly I think the factoring industry and certainly the surveying industry don't have the means to make that happen.
What do you mean, the means?
They don't have a vehicle to instruct it in a lot of cases, because the nature of the tenure again blocks it, because they have to get a consensus amongst all the proprietors, and every single person's agenda is different.
Others want to intervene.
If you're in, you want to ask later, you can do it. Andy and then Jeremy.
Yes, thanks very much, Convener. I'm getting back to the Convener's original question about how many are affected. You said, Mr Denham, that you don't know, and of course we don't actually know, but it would be useful to get a sense of the scale of this. Are we talking about tens, hundreds, thousands? I noticed Mr Diamond's evidence, written evidence, you said there are many flatted dwellings that are blighted already. So those are properties that have got an option B, presumably in the ESW form, or would fail if they were inspected under that regime. You also say there's a significant number of properties which include combustible materials. So I mean, what is the scale of the problem? Are we talking about hundreds, thousands? Are we talking about isolated developments in the harbours side in Edinburgh, Dundee and Glasgow? You can surely give us some sense of scale.
Not really. It's very difficult to give a specific, or not specific figure, but a general figure. But it is substantial, and you would be in thousands.
Thousands, okay.
Thousands.
Yep.
And what I don't want to say is I don't want to say we have got, triple that amount or half of that amount. It's in that level. But we don't. The bottom line is we do not know until such time as an inspection of a building has been undertaken. It's not just necessarily a simple case of walking down the street and saying that's a good one or that's a bad one. You've got to do proper, due diligence to inspect these properties.
Yeah. And is it correct that the problems that we're finding are on buildings of any height, over 11, under 11?
Initially, the figure from the MHCLG guidance, Advice Note 14, was 18 metres. The recent guidance note that has been issued in January is bringing it down to much lower levels.
But in terms of the actual problem, in terms of actual cladding, we're finding it on buildings of all heights.
We are.
We are, right. So the ESW form can be used for a building that's maybe 6 metres?
Yes.
Or 12
Even though it mentions the figure 18 metres in it, it still could be used for that. There is a meeting being hosted by the RSS on 10th of March to look at the reviewing of the form, because it's a very fluid situation that we're into now.
Okay. So, Mr Diamond, you say in your written evidence, in terms of their findings from surveys to date, you have more than 300 developments across Scotland on your books. I mean, those 300 developments alone must be, what, 3, 4, 5, 6,000 individual properties?
Those 300 developments would typically be maybe 6, 8 stairwells on average. You know, it's going to be certainly in the sort of 400 or 500 mark, and then typically within that you would have, on average, again, maybe 10, 12 people in there. I think the thing that I need to be a bit careful of is that we get the referrals, so we get the problem ones already, so our numbers are going to be skewed. So we're in the process just now of actually analysing that, and we're working hard in the background to pin a figure on that at the moment. And every day new data comes in, so I'd be happy to share that with you guys at a point in the future when we're confident that we've reached a stage where the analysis would pass muster.
Yeah.
It's still moving about just now, but a significant, in my opinion, you know, is about as far as I can go just now. But I think you and I have spoken privately about that anyway. So,
okay. And to be clear, to do an invasive survey, you require the permission of the property owner.
Owners, yeah.
So you say in your evidence, Mr. Diamond, you say that our experience is that there's a further group of developments that contain a significant number of properties which include combustible materials in their external envelopes.
Yep.
Can you say something a little bit more about these properties? Were they compliant with building regs when they were built? So this is a legacy issue. Were they not compliant? Were they meant to be compliant but then not built with the correct materials? What sense have you got?
The background to that statement was in relation to the original assumption that everything was ACM based. That has proven not to be the case. In Scotland, we are finding a whole range of different materials on buildings, and it is essentially the combination of the materials that's the problem. In a lot of cases, what we are finding is cladding systems that have two hybrids, a fire-rated version and a non-fire rated version. To the untrained eye, those things are absolutely identical. We're finding cladding systems that have a BBA certificate or an agreement certificate or some other form of third-party accreditation that has not been installed in accordance with the printed, the actual tested construction. We're finding cladding systems that are a mixture of things, and you have no way of establishing what that criteria in terms of fire would be, or any certification whatsoever. By and large, a lot of them did comply with building regulations at the time, but the rules of the game have obviously changed, and would they pass muster now, given the knowledge that we now know post Grenfell and the new testing regimes that have been implemented? I would very much doubt it personally. But most of them would have passed the regs at the time. What I would say is that our experience thus far is that the majority of the problems are in the height bracket where it's 6/7 stories. Now that figures because it's bang on the 18-metre mark, and it's also probably the most, in terms of numbers, it's probably the most common archetype of flats, so it stands to reason that's where it's going to come from. But we're finding a lot of properties where, if they were re-inspected now by, say, the building control officer, I think they would be rejected because there's physical failures in the way that they have actually been constructed. Missing fire breaks, stuff that's not fitted properly, omissions, swaps in materials, lack of certification, a whole range of different failures.
So what's happening in terms of properties that are getting a B rating on the ESW form? There's an issue with the cladding. What's happening with those properties?
They're stuck.
Presumably some are any instructing remedial work?
Not well, other than the kind of high-profile ones at Glasgow Harbour and things like that. When you've got some of the big players, I'm not aware of any of the kind of smaller developments instructing the works at the moment. Maybe some of my other colleagues do, but I certainly don't know of any.
Unfortunately, in Scotland, we do not have any remediation fund set up. In England and Wales, there is a figure initially set off of £200 million to address ACM-clad properties. That, I understand, has now been extended to a greater extent. So unfortunately, homeowners where there is a problem with the cladding, unless the original developer is able to assist, they are left high and dry.
And even if the remedial works are affordable, I mean, it might be not really affordable, but they could potentially just get there, they still require the consent of all the other flat owners.
Yeah, indeed.
Are there any issues where that's happening, where the costs are not too excessive, they're within the scope, possibly, of people, but they're not, they've tried and not succeeded in getting agreement? Or
We haven't reached that stage yet.
Right, we're
I
not
mean,
there.
it's still a relatively new issue. I think it started round about September, and Scotland was kind of affected first because the Home Report has carried out pre-marketing of a property, unlike south of the border, so it became more apparent. But that kind of time of year, the market starts to drop off anyway. Estate agents will generally be telling clients to wait till the start of the new year before they bring the property to the market. So really, we're 2 months into the new year, and I think this is where we're going to start to see all these issues coming around. And the problem is, I mean, the zero value for mortgage purposes clearly is a problem. But the biggest problem that any market has is uncertainty. Buyers and sellers don't, or buyers in particular, don't like uncertainty. So it's not just around whether they can get their funding. Even cash buyers looking at a property that may have a cladding issue, the advice to them is not going to be to buy it without knowing very clearly what that problem is and what the potential liabilities for remediation will be. So until we're in a point where there has been some comprehensive evaluation of the extent of the problem and some understanding of what the remediation path is going to be, I think the market is going to continue to be affected by these uncertainties and to have difficulties.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Come back later, Convener. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. Just a number of questions. Can I just go back to the issue around cladding on all buildings? And obviously we have different height quoted. Can I just check from a lender's perspective, are they saying any property with cladding on it has to have that raised with them, depending on whether it's 1 metre or 18 metres or 21 metres?
So in terms of the process for lenders, we have to have an independent valuation carried out by an independent valuer. If they flag that there is a concern with cladding that may affect the value of the property, then a lender would ask for that to be investigated. And then you would go down the EWS process to do that. If it's a building above 18 metres, that's a fairly understood concern at the moment. Following the UK government's guidance that suggests that buildings below 18 metres may also be a concern, lenders are, and indeed valuers and others, are considering what that means. We are aware, I think, of the difficulties in assessing all buildings and the sheer numbers involved in doing that. And as a result, we're looking to see whether or not if there is a more risk-based approach that could be taken to ensure that you are focusing on the most risky buildings.
But can I just clarify the situation as of today? I go to Mr Smith, can I want to buy a flat here in Edinburgh, and it is 8 metres high, but it has cladding on it. Would I be able to get a mortgage today on that property without any investigation happening?
It would depend on whether or not the independent valuer, acting on behalf of the lender, flags it as a concern that affects the mortgage valuation.
At present, the guidance has not been issued by the majority of high street lenders just now regarding properties below 18 metres, so we await that information. However, some of the guidance that has been issued just now does, and has been issued since August last year, does refer to a kind of covering all statement to say if the valuer believes the property is below 18 metres and there is a potential issue with cladding that could have a material effect on the market value, the surveyor then is to go down the line of recommending an EWS1 form.
Okay, that's kind of helpful. I suppose then lean on, I get my home report done and it comes back with the issue around cladding on it. And I appreciate how long is a piece of string, but how much roughly would it then cost the individual who's trying to sell that flat to get the investigation done to see if the cladding has got an A or B category? And how much roughly would you be charging an average flat owner for that?
We would be charging for the initial survey approximately £900 plus VAT. That's our physical fee, and then there's a professional indemnity to cost to that as well, which does vary from block to block.
And roughly how much would that be?
It's volume sensitive. At its lowest end, it could be £1,000. At its upper end, it could be a couple of £1,000. But what I would say, Mr Balfour, is that there's also a lot of third-party costs attached to these, because sometimes you need to consult with chartered fire engineers, you need cherry pickers to get access up to stuff, you sometimes have to do testing. And for one individual house owner to take all that on board, it's really not feasible. It has to be a common approach in that instance. So
if I've got a block of flats, or if there's 8 flats within a block, and 7 of them are very happy, think we're going to be here for the next 10, 15 years, and I'm the only individual wanting to sell my flat, you're saying at the moment that really is saying you cannot then sell that flat?
if it has cladding, we would report on it, and then we'll put down whether or not we think it would pass or fail. So,
but what I'm trying to work out is how much would it cost that one individual to get the work done to get to that stage?
typically £2,000 plus VAT. That kind of level would be an average.
And that includes you do the cherry pick?
We've no way of knowing that at the outset, because every individual case is different, because it depends on, can you get access to do the surveys. I think there's a lot of developments are just on the high street. You can't get physically, you can't get a permit to go up with a cherry picker, etc. So, but across the board, on average, that's what it would be, about the £2,000 mark. And the majority of that fee at the moment is currently professional indemnity. Now, that may change in the future once more players enter the market, but at the moment, the PI is a major barrier to entry across the board.
Okay, thank you. Just going to Mr. Smith, I mean, you said in your evidence just a moment ago that, particularly buyers don't like uncertainty. I mean, from a law society perspective, from a legal profession, advice that you're giving clients, what are you saying to clients who come to you that saying, there's a property here I'm thinking of buying, you get the home report back and it has a comment about cladding on it. I appreciate every lawyer gives different advice, and I'm not suggesting the law society tells everyone what to do, but what is the general advice likely to be amongst property solicitors in regard to that? Is it not to touch it?
There's two fundamental issues, I suppose. The first one is that if there is an EWS1, our members are not in any way qualified to pass any kind of comment on the EWS1 other than the existence or otherwise of it. So if a buyer is asking the natural question, okay, this has got an EWS1, what does that mean? Then we need to refer them back to the person who prepared the report. We simply can't make any kind of comment. Now that in itself, because of the nature of solicitor-client relationship, could often mean that some clients are going to think, well, I'm not sure I'm very comfortable about this if my solicitor is unable to comment on it. I think other difficulty we've got, the system is bedding in just now, but one of the difficulties we're finding just now is that some survey reports, there's a bit of inconsistency about how the home reports are commenting on these things. Some surveyors are marking up home reports with a 1 and commenting there is cladding, but it's assumed it's non-combustible. Now, our understanding had been that that should be a 3, so it's flagged up so the EWS1 system has to come in. So I think there's still a little bit of uncertainty as to how everybody should process this through, and that of course creates another bit of uncertainty. So at the moment it's very difficult for our members to advise, but solicitors tend to be cautious people, and the obvious kind of advice to somebody is, if we're not sure about it, you're not sure about it, do you have other options that you might be considering?
And are there issues around are there issues around the Solicitors Guarantee Fund and indemnity policies for solicitors, on what advice you give around this? We've heard about surveyors, indemnity policies, are issues around here for yourselves?
We're not building professionals. We're completely unable to comment on the the construction and the fire resistance of a building or the materials used in the building. We can only comment. There is documentation here of the appropriate type, and generally we'd be checking that there is professional indemnity cover behind that. We can't really go beyond that.
My final question, and I appreciate the community wants to move on, but my final question is, how do we solve this? I'm a pragmatic individual. We have an issue here. What is the way forward? Because obviously there are a number of my constituents here within Edinburgh who, over the next few months, may not be able to sell their property. And that will be true in other parts of Scotland as well. So how do we solve this? What's the solution?
To my mind, you can't solve a problem until you know what the problem is. I think a comprehensive survey has to be carried out, and we need to establish what the nature of the problem is. Committees I've been involved in, and many of these colleagues, we see each other's faces almost weekly at the moment. Some kind of means of green lighting properties, so the properties we know there aren't issues with, that kind of moves them aside and lets the market continue with these. We then move on to what are the real problem ones, are the ones that are going to need remediation of some sort. How that can be put in place, given need for majority consensus in doing that, and obviously the bottom line is the cost around carrying out remediation work.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Kenny.
Yeah,
and then
much. Just following on from Jeremy's question there, Mr. Smith's response. You talk about, perhaps carrying out a survey, to green light properties, etc. Who would pay for that if it's going to be done across Scotland? The local authorities, the Scottish Government? How could that? Who could pay for that?
I don't know who would pay for that. I think that's probably beyond my remit. But given, I think what Phil has been saying, that effectively, although a specific survey is done on a specific flat, clearly it relates to the fabric of the whole block. Now, it may be that the cost of carrying out a survey on each individual block, and particularly if it's an advisory one without necessarily needing indemnity cover, may not be a prohibitive cost, and it may be there would be sufficient owners within a block or within any one development that would actually be prepared to do that if there's some kind of arrangement about costs being reimbursed perhaps in terms of a sale. But I think it's the coordination of that as much as the cost that I think is the issue.
What's prohibitive for one person might not be prohibitive for someone else.
Absolutely.
So that's the issue. And a lot of people, Jeremy pointed out, some people might not be want to move, so they might not want to pay anything at all. So there's an issue there. But I mean, in terms of resources, excluding financial, do we have the skilled people in Scotland to carry out a survey like this? I mean, how many months or years would it take to actually undertake this kind of work? And if there was remediation, I mean, the whole point about this issue is it's to try and make homes safer. But if we don't have the people with the skills to actually do the work, if it's identified, and the people who need the work done since the change in standards can't afford it, then it's a kind of, what's the purpose of all of this?
Do we have the skills in Scotland? Yeah, I believe we do. Particularly if we can go down the route of doing the kind of construction identification type model, because that would then allow a whole firm of chartered building surveyors, architects, engineers to be involved while we sort out the PI issues attached to the EWS1 forum, because that's what's generating the bills from the PI companies. But in terms of just doing the routine survey work, yeah, I think we could develop a model fairly readily so that the marketplace could be split across a whole bunch of different businesses to accelerate it. Can I jump back ever so slightly to a point that Mr Balfour made? I think another key thing is here for all of us is to stop this getting any worse. Our largest growing sector of inquiries at the moment is actually new build contractors who are building flats just now and have now found out that they have got concluded missives on transactions and it's hitting the buffers when it goes to the lenders. That seems to me to be quite an easy one to sort, but it could account for, we could be going back the way if that isn't actually cattled very quickly, coped with, because we do have an awful lot of inquiries just now for builders who are building in Glasgow and Edinburgh, Aberdeen at the moment, for stuff that has, for example, cedar cladding or cladding externally that's fallen foul of EWS1.
I mean, I think that's a sensible point. I think it's one we certainly take on board. I mean, now, one of the points you made earlier, Mr Diamond, was you talked about some of the buildings that you've looked at didn't even comply with the standards as they were previously. In such instances, you know, Mr Smith, you being a legal representative here, should the liability not fall on the builders as opposed to the owners, because they'll have bought these properties in good faith, expecting them to comply with all relevant standards? So surely if a builder has been skimping on materials or whatever and not even met the cladding requirements of, you know, pre-Grenfell, then should the builder not be liable?
Well, I guess from a legal perspective, that there may be many legal aspects coming into that. I think in the case of the bigger household builders, they've presumably got commercial and reputational issues, which perhaps puts pressure on them not to just walk away from these things. A lot of smaller developments are done under a single purpose vehicle, a company that is set up purely to do that development. Once the development's done, the company is just wound up, and so the developer doesn't exist.
Yeah,
now,
I'm aware of that,
obviously
yeah.
you've got a system of subcontractors, etc., and you know, it may work its way down, but morally there may be no doubt, particularly in those kind of cases, that they ought to, but the legal process is never a quick one anyway, and I suspect the further back in time that you have to go, the more difficult it may be. I think over the last 10-year period, I mean, most buildings come with 10-year warranty cover, so there may well be avenues down that for these kind of cases, but going beyond that probably becomes more difficult and certainly lengthy and again costly, pursuing legal remedies that might or might not.
Yeah, I mean, because the human cost of this we haven't discussed so far. I mean, we've been given extensive data by our clerks on this. For example, from the Sunday Times, where a woman called Abigail Tubis, for example, she's actually in Leeds, but she says she's been faced with a £35,000 bill. She's an account manager, and her husband is having to put off having a baby, and it breaks me. And it says her 65-year-old neighbour is a supermarket checkout worker, no possibility of being able to afford this. Made ill by stress. You know, another neighbour is 32, a special needs teacher, bought her flat through Help to Buy scheme, and if you buy a flat supported by the government and the council, signed up with the council, you never think it's unsafe. So why? Surely a lot of people have bought all their houses in good faith, according to the standards of the time as they thought, and then suddenly being presented with bills. Would it not be appropriate, in your views, as a panel, that the government, whether it's Scottish or UK or a combination of both, should effectively be the people who ultimately foot the bill for this? I mean, they're the ones that have changed the laws and the standards and all that, not the folk who live in these flats.
I think it would have to look at to see whether the properties have been built to comply with the building warrant and completion certificate. There will be, I'm sure, in due course, legal actions that will take place to decide who's responsible for the construction and the materials used. But that's not helping the cases of the people you refer to and many others that exist throughout Scotland, throughout England as well. We are in a situation, therefore, where I think the case you're referring to is the payment of fire wardens to walk around that property. Now, thankfully, I'm in a position that's not been an issue, certainly that I'm aware of in the flat developments in Glasgow. The council has been there to assist people, and in that development in particular, the developer has stood up and said they will attend to the building, which is very laudable at the extensive cost that has got to be taking place. But as Brian has mentioned, there are developers and there are developments where the developers are no longer about, whether the joint venture partnership is there. We had a recession which took a number of developers down, and we're left in a situation where the homeowners, like the ones you've described, are left in limbo, absolute in limbo. And you know, one of the calls of the RICS is that there should be a remediation fund set up in place.
You mentioned that earlier,
and
yeah, I think that's
that
important.
shouldn't just be limited to a specific clad material, which is in England and Wales to ACM. ACM being the material that's being attributed to the Grenfell tragedy. There are many other types of cladding materials that are in existence. So I think that, you know, one step that we would call for is the setting up of a remediation fund to help people out once the building has been inspected, because the EWS1 form could be viewed as a triage, and as has been said before, it then identifies the problem properties that are that have been put away and cannot be readily sold or remortgaged. And I think the remediation then should be focused on them. So I would call on the Scottish Government that that is set up in place. Also, we have a situation where there are some people who are in a position where they can afford to sell. Or they can afford to buy another property, be it they convert it to a buy-to-let or some other mortgage facility. Now, I know that there are examples of people in developments in Glasgow where they've had to buy another property and had to pay additional land and building transaction tax supplement at 4%. And that is something that, again, we would call on the Scottish Government to look at removing from these people who are caught in a trap. They need to get that extra money, which can be substantial amount, £60,000 it can be. And that seems an unreasonable tax put onto them, where there's no fault of their own. They have bought a property in good faith because the building warrant and completion certificates have been obtained. So I think there's something got to be looked at in that.
So just one last question I'm making, convener, and that is basically, how much should the remediation fund be? I mean, they started with 200 million in England, which seems to me quite a small amount of money relative to the size of the country and the scale of the problem. So what kind of monies would we be talking about for remediation fund, and should it be a grant or a loan?
I don't know how much it should be.
And should people who apply to that, should it be a loan they get, or should it be a grant?
I wouldn't be in a position to answer that question. I don't know what the solution to it is. There would be a question of means testing. You know, there's all these other questions that I think are very, very relevant and very good points. I'm certainly not in a position to answer that. I don't think we are in a position to answer that as representatives here today.
Not necessarily answer it, but can anyone make any recommendation how they feel it could best help a resolution to this situation? Not just Mr Denham, obviously, but anyone else who wants to suggest.
From our point of view, we would entirely agree that we don't think individual homeowners should be footing the cost for remediation, where it's been shown that they need to have it done to make their building safe. That just doesn't seem fair. It makes sense for the governments to step in, both UK and Scotland, if necessary.
Sorry, especially if the fact if they can't afford it, they wouldn't make it safe anyway, because they'll not be able to pay for it.
Indeed.
So it'll never be safe.
Quite the mechanism for how you do that is open for debate. The obvious thing to do is try and get it done, get the work done as quickly as possible to make the building safe, and then work out the legal wranglings about who's ultimately liable after that. I don't think that any of us can really answer whether or not that should be a loan or a grant. Grant seems fairer, but obviously that's not our job to make that decision.
Can I just make a small point there that Scottish Government have helped to buy shared equity, golden shares, all these types of other kind of shared equity models. So the government, I would have thought, would have a good stab at assessing their own portfolio to understand what that could look like.
Thanks very much. Thank you, convener.
Thank you, Sarah. You wanted to come in and point was raised there.
Thanks.
Yeah, you.
Thanks very much. I want to come in. We got a very useful briefing from the Property Managers Association in Scotland, and one or two of the issues that we've just been discussing were raised by them. One was the suggestion that the Scottish Government convenes a working group because this is complicated. There's a range of suggestions being made, one about having a register across the country. That's been mentioned already, so that you know which buildings are fine, where there are buildings with elements of compromise, and where there are buildings where the whole building needs to be addressed. But do we need some kind of leadership to bring this together now? Because each of you are finding it difficult to answer all the questions. And is this a point where we need to bring this together? Because on one level, I can see the advantage of our remediation fund. But if we're still having buildings that are not being built to the right standard, there really needs to be an issue about building warrants and about approvals of existing buildings. Do we need to be much more rigorous about this and actually have some expectations set about new buildings that are being built, existing buildings, and then some kind of regulatory process to enable buildings where there might be problems for all the owners to have to work together?
I think the answer to your first part of your question is very clearly yes. We need leadership. We need everything pulled together. We need to understand what the extent of the problem is, and we need to find the solutions for it. I think the second thought that came to mind, which has just completely slipped my head now, may come back to me. In fact, if I'll pass on. I'll recall what it was. I'll bring it back. Thank you.
I would certainly agree that we do need a task force, a working group, or something to move this forward and move it forward very quickly, because there are people whose lives are on hold. There are people in buildings that are potentially dangerous, and you know, as time progresses, there is always a risk that's going to affect members of the public on this process. So we do need that. I think, as Phil's mentioned before, the new build market, I think that's probably the easier one that we can start with. And you're absolutely right. I think we draw the line in the sand and we move that further forward from the developers. And I do think there is a belief and a support in the new build market that, if it's not taking place, can't readily start to take place from now on. So at least that will future-proof something there. I think the problem is the legacy issue that we have got in place. You know, who's to blame? Well, I don't think that is something we need to address today. We need to address today properties that are potentially dangerous, and we need to address it so these properties get back on the marketplace so that people's lives can continue. That's really all I think we all want.
Yep. Had the conversations with the Chief Exec from Homester Scotland informally, and kind of indicated to her how that could be tackled. I think she started to convey that to her members, but it does need a bit more of a push, I think, to be addressed. That is an easy one to fix. Also strikes me there's a lot of properties out there that are actually okay, that could be published and released and just immediately, you know, let back onto the market. But it's how we do that professionally. That's so to just share my colleagues' comments. Yeah, most definitely there needs to be something set up that allows some kind of consensus how that can be moved forward.
Yeah, so some kind of working group with the Scottish Government taking a lead that would enable all the key parties to come in.
Yep.
I mean, the other thing that's been suggested by the Property Managers Association was the creation of and management of a comprehensive register of all flats with cladding, and those where there's a recommendation of remedial action. One of the debates that we've clearly been listening to this morning is about encouraging all owners to take part in this process, and whether all owners can afford to do that. We've had lengthy discussions on tenements in terms of repair and maintenance because of the legal system in Scotland, and a solution was identified there, which is going to take a lot of time to work through. But do we need a similar issue here with flats, so that there's a regulatory process looked at where we need to change regulations, and then where we need funding to actually make this happen?
There may be, and it actually does attach to the point that I forgot earlier, so before I forget it again, I think one of my feelings on this is that we have a very natural human reaction to Grenfell, which is to rebase our societal tolerance of risk to zero. Now, many discussions, again, that have taken place have been around the fact that you probably can't get a building that is completely fire-proofed. We've seen tenement fires even in the last few months in Glasgow, where stone buildings have been affected substantially by fire. So I think one of the difficulties we have, and particularly maybe in changing regulations and things, is that we work in a knee-jerk reaction that we're back to zero. I think we have to decide where that tolerable level is, and then we rebase at that. So trying to change regulations immediately might be a difficult thing, because we may then come in with impossible solutions. So I think that one's going to work through. But that again is a kind of debate that really, to my mind, requires leadership from government and direction put in that way.
I think not just about the standards, but about regulations, about requiring people to work together as owners.
Yeah,
it's a debate we've had on tenements, and it empowers those who have agreed, where you get a majority or 90 out of 100 owners say they want to work together, but it's how the remaining 10 owners are brought into that equation, because at the moment that either potentially puts all the costs on the other owners or the people wanting to move, and surely that's not fair either.
No, absolutely. I mean, that remains an ongoing problem in any shared ownership property in Scotland, whether it's an older tenement or whether it's a modern block. is getting everybody agreeing to do these things and having a mechanism of enforcing it that doesn't involve a lot of expense, either in the cost of pursuing or the paying of shares.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Anna?
Good morning, panel. Picking up a few issues. Firstly, on the PI problems, can somebody explain in a nutshell exactly what the problem is? Is it lack of skills of surveyors? Is it UK finance being difficult? Is it the issue of getting the all the owners to sign up, which Mr MacDonald referred to quite early on in our discussion? What is exactly the problem? Because if we could work out exactly what the problem was, we could get a better handle on what would be the interventions best made to solve it.
We've just recently gone through that pain. There's nobody left in the marketplace to. The PI marketplace has just contracted now to 2 or 3 players. I think post Grenfell, they decided that they didn't want any risks attached to the construction, surveying, architectural type industries, and they've all run a mile. We took us nearly 4 months to get our professional indemnity in place to cover the cladding survey element of what the business does. And our costs went from about 8 or 9 grand a year to just over 80. That's an awful lot of money for a small business, but that's further compounded by the fact that we're committed to that for 5 years because of the duration that's stated on the EWS1 forum. So we've taken a great big risk that there'll be a couple more players in the marketplace, but it's basically the market for PI has shrunk to next to nobody's left now.
In that regard then, what role can UK finance play? Because if UK finance is sticking to the old situation where there was a greater fluidity in the PI market, and there isn't now, which you quite clearly state, Mr Diamond, surely it's not sufficient for UK finance just to say, well, that's not our problem. If that's the reality of the insurance market, what's UK finance going to do?
So UK finance doesn't represent insurers.
No, I
They're
appreciate
not
that,
our
but
members.
it's your conditions vis-a-vis the valuation process that impact then on people being able to get mortgages.
So, as I say, we don't represent insurers, so I can't comment in terms of the market for actual.
No, but we
PI
just
cover.
heard that there
But
isn't a
in terms
market
of whether
really,
or not
so-
people actually need to have PI cover, I think pretty much every professional wants to have PI cover for the activities they carry out. I don't think that's an unusual thing for professionals to want to have. If the market is shrinking for them, that's a different question, and that's a different debate.
That was the
to be had
question I
with
was
insurers.
asking.
It's not something that we have.
No,
an
but
impact on.
you are a key player in this whole process, and I just wondered what discussions within UK finance there may have been to reflect the changed market.
We've had some discussions with the insurance market, but it's the insurance market that has the issue there rather than UK finance members. It's whether or not the professional guys around this table can get the cover they need to carry out their work, rather than something that we're telling them they must have.
Well, sorry.
It's a requirement of our chartership that we have to hold professional
No, I
indemnity.
get that,
We have no choice in it to. So I be totally clear that if we didn't have to carry the cost, we certainly wouldn't. But we very much do have to carry the cost.
It just seems right there, whatever else happens, however much money is thrown at this, that will remain a key problem. So actually you won't solve anything until you solve that. Just saying. So I think an awful lot of focus would need to be on that issue, it seems to me, because that is the blockage from the get-go before you get into any other issue about remediation and
That'll be a
cost.
cost, and a significant cost for homeowners, is professional indemnity insurance. It doesn't matter what everything we try, as Phil said, it's down to the players. If more PI providers come into the market, the cost will reduce. At present, they're risk averse.
Okay. Moving on to the issue then of the discussions about who funds remediation. I mean, obviously, at the moment, it's been said this morning that we don't know the scale of the problem. We know that there is a problem, and for particular individuals, it will be a very, very significant problem. And I think we're about to hear from a constituency MSP in that regard. But we don't know the scale of the problem. Therefore, it's quite difficult to talk in sort of, even in broad brush, in terms of the likely cost of any fund. I understand with regard to the fund in England and Wales that it is, at the moment anyway, with respect to buildings over 18 metres. But I also understand that there's another condition which requires the individuals to make reasonable efforts to recover the money. I'm not entirely sure what in detail they're expected to do, but I think it's important to bear that point in mind, and Mr Smith will realise exactly what that may or may not entail. But I think it was the Property Managers Association which had suggested that actually this could be a loan fund, so that you would get a loan and it would be a security over the property following sale to be repaid. And given that, you know, any public money, if any were available, and obviously we're about to go into a budget, I don't know if there'll be calls for money to be set aside for this, and obviously they would have to say where that's to come from. But, you know, if there were to be such an approach, that might seem to be a more reasonable approach if you take the view that obviously if you have public money, should public money be going to enhance the value of private property? Is that what taxpayers should be paying for in the round? So that would be perhaps a more philosophical discussion on that point.
It is a more philosophical discussion. However, I think you've got to look at a number of these properties people will have purchased at probably quite reasonable prices because of the effects of cladding and various other high-rise issues in terms of the support of the public. The values will have dropped down. And people may be in or close to being in a situation where there is no equity in that property, and therefore, whilst you may wish to put a remediation cost, which could be £30,000 per flat against that property, if the property is to be sold, there may be no money to recoup that £30,000. And what do we do in that situation? Is that a loan that would roll on to their next purchase of property, and that would then affect them in terms of their mortgage calculation and the availability of mortgage terms there? So it has a fairly significant effect if it's a loan put against the property. And I don't know if lenders would be very keen on an additional or a secondary loan being put against that property, who would then have first call if there was a default in the mortgage there. So there's an awful lot of situations that would apply to that proposal.
Well, indeed, and none of
that
this is easy. So,
No.
but it seems to me that you know, I take on board absolutely what you say as a former conveyancing lawyer. But of course, there are various circumstances that may be involved, including that actually the value of some of these flats may, once this problem is sorted, may, you know, not just go back to the purchase price, but be quite in excess of it. So, you know, all these things have to be factored in, and I think, Mr Denham, you yourself suggested in response to Kenny Gibson's point that actually there could have to be a means testing approach to this in any event. So there are lots of issues to be looked at.
There are many things to look at.
Nothing sadly is straightforward in life. One last suggested area question at this moment. The important issue of insurance. Now, I was reading a paper we got from the ABI for this meeting. I don't know if you've all had a chance to see it, but I'm sure we can arrange for that to be circulated to you after the fact. But an interesting statement was made to the effect, and I'll quote directly, "Buildings insurance is not a mandatory requirement, but most mortgage companies do require buildings insurance to be in place when lending." I just wonder, first of all, if I could clarify with Mr Jupp, do you know of any mortgage companies that don't require buildings insurance? It just seemed a very odd suggestion.
I'm not aware of any mortgage lender that doesn't have a requirement in their terms and conditions for a building to have buildings insurance.
Yes, well, I just wanted to clarify that because I would have been astonished, but that seems to be what the ABI's view is, so I don't know.
I guess if you own a building outright, it's your decision whether or not you have insurance on it.
Yes, but then there wouldn't be a mortgage, there wouldn't be a standard security on the building. So anyway, so in that regard, the ABI also suggests, I'm just looking for the exact quote, but so they go on to say, "We have seen no evidence of changes in either buildings or constant insurance driven by issues involving combustible cladding or zero valuations." Okay, so that's the ABI of the 24th of February. This is to general, but then in the paper from Diamond and Co of the 25th of February, they end up by saying there is a developing issue with the insurance industry removing cover from buildings that have combustible products.
We're seeing an increase in instructions from factors where we have been asked to do the construction identification route because the insurance people are putting those buildings on a pathway and saying you've got 12 months to fix this issue, basically. So we're getting a growing number of instructions about that, and that's coming from the insurance industry.
I think that was also in our submission as well. We're aware of one case in Glasgow, a very iconic building, where the property owners had the same insurer for 4 years. And this year, this renewal, because of the awareness of a certain type of cladding, the insurers have reevaluated the risk on the building, so that they're now looking at it as a singular loss, and that's £115 million potential on one loss. And because of that, the premiums rose by 40%, and indeed the entire cover isn't burdened by the original insurer. The broker on that has actually had to go through the Lloyd's market to obtain the additional top-up insurance. And in addition to that, the insurers have given the owners 12 months to rectify the situation, or the cover will be withdrawn.
Okay, I mean, obviously very worrying. I don't know in terms of the building in question whether there would be any standard security on that, but in general terms, for many of these properties, there would be a standard security extant. And therefore, I wonder, given you know, the mortgage lender's interest in particular in this particular issue, because that would be a breach of the mortgage conditions, what discussions UK Finance may have had with the ABI on this particular issue, the issue of the threat of withdrawing insurance cover to properties that are subject to standard securities in Scotland.
We haven't had any specific issues on
You've had no discussions with the ABI about this?
Not as yet.
Do you plan to have discussions with the ABI on this?
Given some of the comments today, yes.
Okay. Right, thank you.
That's a good point to finish there, Annabelle. Graham, you wanted to come back in briefly?
Yeah, I'll just follow up on the insurance angle if I can. And Mr MacDonald, in your submission on this point, you suggest that there should be a Scottish Government-backed insurance guarantee where cover's withdrawn, presumably, or to prevent cover from being withdrawn. How do you see that working?
We've indicated the similar situation with the flood risk insurance, but the mechanics of it obviously aren't down to us. But there has to be a default security arrangement for the owners of these properties. As my colleagues have indicated, this has been thrown on them from nowhere.
Yeah.
They haven't done anything wrong. They've bought properties that they felt had met the building standards. The mortgage companies who have provided the finance originally have thought that the buildings were up to standard, and it just seems to me to be completely potentially catastrophic if insurers are prepared to withdraw cover. They obviously have to protect their business. They don't want to be ongoing with risks that would obviously affect them in the long term. But it just seems to me that there needs to be some kind of backstop here, an arrangement, a security arrangement for the owners of these buildings, so that if they do get into this situation, I mean, the example that we've raised here, we think it's entirely likely that the building in question have a very active owners association. They have successfully managed to fund an incredible amount of work to the building historically. It's likely that they will be able to deal with it, but there will be other ones that will come up, perhaps as the full reality of the situation starts to dawn, maybe with more serious problems in this building. You know, I would fully expect the insurers, if not to withdraw cover, that maybe to look at restrict cover on these properties.
Okay.
So there has to be some sort of fallback there for the owners.
This iconic building in Glasgow, you're not willing to say what it is, but is it city centre?
Yes.
Yeah. Was it used as something else originally? Okay.
We have Wally thing,
that would
right?
be my last question.
Let's pass on
I might know which one he's on about. So going
Briefly, Graham.
yes, indeed. The professional indemnity insurance issue. So we've come up with requests that you think the Scottish Government could do. Is the professional indemnity issue something that the UK Government could be looking at and bringing people together to solve? Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
I think it is. My understanding of the flood position was that, I think it's probably going back about 10 years ago now, that the UK Government well, for want of a better word, lent on the insurers
Yeah.
to ensure that they continued cover, which they were threatening to withdraw. Now, I don't know what all the terms were, and whilst I can see how that could work for buildings insurers, you would think that perhaps PI insurers as well,
Yeah.
some kind of arrangement or pressure, whatever it may be, should at least be exerted to try and come to some kind of arrangement there.
Because that looks to me like a bit of a market failure there. That, you know, if this cover's being withdrawn, and you know, people like yourself, Mr. Diamond, are facing huge increases in costs. Yeah, so I think maybe there is a role for the UK government. Should they be working with the Scottish government on this, or is that
I think absolutely both should be working together.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Andy, and then the ever patient Sandra White.
So just a brief couple of questions. First of all, on the 10-year warranties that new properties can have, would that warranty kick in if it were found that there were materials in that building that were not as specified?
It may do, and I believe that in some NHBC, for instance, I think do have cases which relate to cladding, which are ongoing there.
Okay.
But again, it may depend on the detail
Sure.
as to whether it comes within the
And
policy.
on the new build problem, Mr. Diamond, you were saying a few things about this. I mean, why are properties that are going up today facing any problems at all?
Because there is a distinct difference between what is acceptable under the building regs and what is acceptable in the new MHCLG guidance. The building regs would allow you to have combustible products outside the building, and that's it in a nutshell. It's the two things are related, but they're unrelated as well in some respects. So,
Okay, so the bottom line is that the lending industry is risk averse, and it's risk averse. The building regs are not risk averse.
no. The building regs, I think, are great documentation. We looked at one in Edinburgh, the new build, full-blown sprinkler system, top to toe, state-of-the-art development, and it wouldn't pass EWS1 because it has this timber cladding up the outside of the building, and that particular developer's been very responsible and said, well, we're actually going to take that off and put a non-combustible product in its place. The two things, they conflict against each other.
Okay, Mr. Jupp, have you got any comments on that? Because it seems to me that if buildings are being built to current standards, lenders should be, broadly, all other things being equal, content to lend.
I think the issue comes down to whether or not that there is an impact on value of having a building that's potentially unsafe. I appreciate the building regs and the new guidance coming out from UK government on cladding and high-rise buildings, but I think if you're a responsible lender, you have to question whether or not it's right to lend to somebody to buy a property in a building which is potentially down the line unsafe and will have a remediation cost coming down the line of it. I don't think that's an unfair position to take.
So would it be, because I understand in England and Wales combustible material has been banned, whereas in Scotland we still allow combustible material, would it be your view that we should also ban combustible material?
UK Finance suggested that, we should not use combustible materials.
Certainly in my view that on flats, where there's a common element to it, we can design that out. It's crazy that we haven't already.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, thanks, Andy. Sandra?
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you for allowing me to come along today. Some really good questions and answers, and I wanted to pick up on some. But first of all, I want to say that when you're talking about the scale of the problem, I mean, I had a surgery and I had 4 representatives from residents, and from that residence block, or 4 blocks, there was just under 1,000 houses, and that's only 4 blocks in that small part down at the harbour, and not just the harbour but in the city centre as well. So it's a massive, massive problem. And, I have people coming who, like has been said before, that can't really afford to pay any of this money out. So there's 3 issues in this particular, more than that. But first issue is, this has happened. We want to try and resolve it. Second issue is that people are worried generally about their safety in these flats. Absolutely. And then the third issue is the cost as well, and that has been well proposed by yourselves too. And the situation, some of the answers that I've been asked to pick up on, and some people have already, is the fact that you're talking about the cladding. Now, we're talking about getting experts to look at the cladding. Now, cost of that, as a lady from Edinburgh actually came to see me, and she paid £700 to get a certificate, £700. Others have been told it's thousands of pounds because the cladding is just on the outside, a small decorative piece on the outside. But what, for clarification for me to take back to my constituents is, if it's got cladding on it, you won't lend on it at all until it has been tested. So you don't know what that cladding entails, whether it's safe or it's high-rise building. You don't know what that contains until you get that tested. So everybody that lives there has to pay this monies.
It doesn't necessarily need tested. It needs identified more than. And if you've got experience in cladding, you can generally tell what it is. The process is that you would start effectively with a desktop survey, then a site visit, and then you're saying, right, there's 22 different types of cladding on that development, and you go through them one by one by one. Some of them you'll be fairly readily identify. You'll know what they are: brick, block, render. Other ones you can do some disruptive survey techniques on site and identify fairly readily. Testing really is only required when you can't identify what's there, or you get something a bit oddbod that doesn't have all the proper.
Sorry for interrupting you. In a particular area, in a huge big, development down at the waterfront in Glasgow, they couldn't get anybody here in Scotland to do anything. They actually contacted a firm in England, and they were told to take a piece out of the cladding themselves and post it down. I won't name the firm. Post it down, and then they came back and said that, well, it's a huge big area, 2 blocks were apparently needed to get it sorted, and then one which is adjoining, built by a different developer, unfortunately, as well, was fine. So you've got this huge big block. One part is being told they need to get sorted, and the other part is being told, well, you're fine. But when it comes to having to pay for it, then everybody's got to pay for it. So, in their eyes, and sometimes in my eyes as well, there's an awful lot of money here being put about and costing the residents a fortune, and somebody else is making a fortune out of it. And that's the way a lot of people see it too. So I'm desperately worried that we're just the tip of the iceberg here. We're coming up to May, when obviously people are starting to move house. It's only not a lot at this particular time, but it's going to absolutely mushroom. And as Mr MacDonald has said, the difference in Scotland is you need a majority of the owners in regards to that. So I'm hoping that perhaps we had mentioned what's happening. I'm looking at the fact that you mentioned about a comprehensive survey to be carried out, and I think that's a great idea. But I think Sarah Boyack picked up on the point that when it was discovered about the Grenfell, the Scottish Government asked each individual council to do a survey on their properties. Now, they did it at Glasgow City Council, and in my particular area, in my constituency, there was a block which you mentioned yourself, and the developer actually paid to get it repaired. But the other blocks were not identified, and they're just coming to light now. Sorry. So I don't know how you do this survey, and the developers, all it was done was looking at on a plan. They didn't actually go out. So that's one thing. I think a comprehensive survey has to be done, and we're looking at the scale of charges as well. So can you tell me, do you have a register of experts with the skills? Do you have a scale of charges so that people know what they're dealing with, basically? And how do we resolve this particular instance? And when we're talking about a remuneration fund, I generally believe that the property developers should be putting into that remuneration fund, because some of these properties were being developed when they knew about the cladding was unsafe. And I know there's a legal aspect of it, and that's ongoing in some of the properties in Glasgow, but they should actually be putting monies in, because they're the developers who knew that this was coming on board. The cladding we're going to use didn't fit the building regulations, and yet some of them still built. And I think we need to look at that. And my final one, sir, sorry, the convener, is about the certification. I really think we need to stop self-certification by builders. And we need somebody to look at that certification throughout, because I find that the builders that we're talking about, not all of them, usually the big builders, they self-certify and it does not meet the criteria. So I just wonder what you thought about that. Is that okay?
If I could pick up on one of the points you made, which I think is one that we've experienced, and that is around who is qualified to do these inspections and provide EWS1. We have seen, I mean, there haven't been a huge number of them yet, they're starting to come in, but we have seen examples of companies providing these who may not carry professional indemnity insurance to do them. It's very difficult. When Guidance Note 14 came out, there was a big list of bodies whose members would be qualified to provide them. There's some surprising ones, such as the Institute of Town Planners, who one wouldn't have normally thought would be involved in the detail of building construction. And from the perspective of a solicitor, I'd explain that as a buying solicitor, we can't comment on the certificate itself. All we can comment on is the fact it's been done. But the two concerns we are going to have is the person doing it competent and able to do it, not just a member of a professional organisation, but actually competent and able, and do they carry professional indemnity insurance? We've also heard of stories from down south about fraudulent EWS1 forms, and I haven't heard any evidence of them north of the border yet, but it can only be a matter of time. So even with this in place, there are still risks around that is not actually solving the problem.
And I think we need to be very careful if there's going to be a register of these properties and they're being surveyed, that the information that's being gathered isn't being gathered from the plans for the property. But perhaps the one you were referring to that we were involved in a couple of years ago was a property where the council identified that there was ACM, which was the material in the Grenfell Tower, on the building. The owners of that development were written to be forewarned about that. But actually, when we put boots on the ground with surveyors, they said, "Are you having a laugh? There's no ACM in this building." So, any comprehensive survey of these buildings has got to be boots on the ground. We can't take the council records for granted at all.
Thank you for that. Sorry, Jim, but thank you for that, because that's a real concern.
Guys, sorry to interrupt. You were referring to the word cladding. We've now moved on from cladding. We're now on external wall system, which is the EWS. So cladding was the original concern, but it's how it's made up with insulation behind that, whether it's flammable insulation, whether there's fire stops and various other things. So I think that, not to be pedantic, we really should be referring to external wall systems rather than cladding. It started off with cladding, we've moved on to it. But you're absolutely right. But I do believe in the example that you've given in sending off down to whoever it is down south, whatever else in the world, that's really not going to answer the question. That has been a false trail that they've gone down, because you can take a bit of cladding and it can be from any point in the building. It could be below 18 metres and it'd be flammable and it'd be an issue. It could be above 18 metres and it could be fine. And you've also got to get the permission of the co-owners of the building to remove sections of cladding. So we've got that. The issue started off with originally ACM. We've now moved on to HPL. We've moved on to various other types of cladding. So it's or external wall systems, I'm falling into myself. It's no longer that. We will find other ones. I can pretty sure there'll be other systems that will come under the equation. And the big issue here, as we've mentioned before, is not so much the cost. The cost of actually a professional doing the inspection in times of hours is probably not unreasonable. The question is to have the professional indemnity insurance behind them to provide a meaningful report that is going to support what's being provided. And unfortunately, that is not in the ability of anyone sitting here to decide what that cost is. So whilst the headline is it's a lot of money for homeowners, we as a profession would like it to be less. But the vast majority is costs that we have got to pass on, because if we don't, you wouldn't be asking for us for the report.
Can I pick up on a point you made if we've got time? You mentioned self-certification. There is a mechanism there where Scottish Government can influence this. Years ago, the building control departments were very active on site. The building control officers were out of the office, they were in your face, they were inspecting, recording, That doesn't happen anymore. And if that alone was changed and these guys were given their place in life and they could actually go out and and do their jobs, we wouldn't have half these problems, because I think it cuts in one thing and another, and there are a whole raft of reasons why. But the building control guys, a lot of really good qualified surveyors in there that could stop this happening in the first place if they were out boots on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much. An earlier report by us did suggest that we bring back Clerk of Works and a way it used to
Go
be
a
done
long way
before.
for helping, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, just before I bring us to close, the ABI have been mentioned quite a few times today. We did invite them, but they refused to come as they didn't think they had a significant contribution to make. And I think it's clear today that it was the exact opposite of that. So obviously we'll be writing again to them to get their views and maybe get them in front of us at a future meeting. Okay, and in that case, can I just thank everybody for their attendance this morning? That was a very, very useful session. I now conclude the public part of today's meeting and move the meeting into private. The committee will consider the next steps in relation to this matter. Thank you very much.